Chokepoint 2, Qatar's North Field, helium by LNG. While the Panhandle smooths time, Qatar manufactures scale. To see why, start offshore above a blue horizon that hides the North Field, one of the largest single accumulations of natural gas on Earth, part of the same reservoir Iran calls South Pars. The genius wasn't that the gas was rich in helium. It was. The genius was welding helium extraction onto some of the world's cheapest, steadiest LNG trains and letting volume do the math. Because when those trains pause, clinics and fabs and ocean away feel it. Here's how the day actually runs. Feed gas flows from the field into a complex that looks like a small city. Separation, dehydration, fractionation, refrigeration, the mile of pipe you'll never tour. Helium hitches a ride in tiny concentrations. Strip it early and you waste cold. Strip it late and you lose recovery. Qatar's Helium 1 and Helium 2 plants sit where the thermodynamics favor capture, pulling helium off as the LNG process steps down temperatures and pressures. A cryogenic column does precision work. Compressors push, cold boxes hum. Out comes crude helium, then refined, then liquid loading into ISO containers that look like white, square boats of frost. Why it matters is simple: throughput. When your LNG trains move ocean-scale volumes every day, even parts per million helium becomes serious tonnage. Costs spread across a balanced, export-driven machine. That's how Qatar vaulted to top exporter status: low marginal cost, high reliability, and ships leaving constantly. Asia's fabs buy contracts that ride this metronome. European buyers hedge Panhandle risk with Qatari volumes. The spot market calms when these trains run like clockwork. But tie your helium to LNG and you inherit LNG's calendar. A planned turnaround on a train, 30 to 45 days, means helium goes dark with it. You do inventory choreography, build stock ahead, pre-position containers, hope nothing else trips. When the 2017 Gulf diplomatic rift hit, airspace and land routes pinched. Helium moved by sea eventually, but the pause revealed the fragility. You can have the cold boxes humming and still lose days to paperwork, port calls, and boil-off in the heat. Micro story: a buyer in Taiwan watched a buffer tick down. 9 days, 7-5. A rerouted ISO slipped through alternate ports and rolled into the yard 2 days before a purge gas changeover would have forced idles. The plant manager didn't send a memo. He walked the etch bay and told the night shift, "We made it." Then he signed a contract that split future volumes across 2 suppliers. Zoom into the plant floor and you see a different discipline: uptime by ritual. Operators live by turnaround plans measured in years. Spares are stocked in multiples. Bearings and sensors get swapped before they squeal. Helium units aren't the main show against LNG revenue, but they're integrated enough that a helium trip can complicate a train's rhythm. The fix is cultural as much as mechanical. Treat helium as a first-class citizen. In recent years, Qatar invested like that. Larger units, better redundancy, cleaner logistics paths. The payoff is global. Fewer scrambles for radiology chiefs in Paris when one pump falters in Ras Laffan. Contracts carry their own physics. Long-term offtake stabilizes both sides, buyers lock price bands and volumes, producers plan maintenance with less drama. But that stability can lull. If 2 trains schedule overlapping maintenance and a third takes a hiccup, allocations ripple across continents. In hot months, every extra day an ISO sits at a transshipment port bleeds product. The smart shippers game the sun. Late-night loadouts, fast clearance, cold staging near the quay. A half-degree saved at the dock translates to liters in a hospital 2 weeks later. Meanwhile, growth looms. North Field expansion promises more LNG and by extension more helium capacity. That sounds like salvation, but commissioning is where cryo plants learn humility. A turbo expander vibrates wrong, a control loop fights a ghost, a weld weeps at cold. One unit offline for weeks tightens a market that assumed it would be there. The right way to plan is boring. Treat new Qatari tons as upside until they've run a boring 6 months. Procurement teams that forget that end up writing frantic emails to labs. Human moment: a Ras Laffan operator keeps a Polaroid of his son's chest X-ray taped near the HMI screen. He jokes it's why he double-checks set points. He's not kidding. He understands a drift here lands in a clinic there. There's one more angle: politics at sea level. Shipping lanes, insurance, port access. Small policy changes can add days to voyages and liters to loss. The 2017 rift was a master class in how non-technical constraints throttle a technical system. After that, Qatar diversified routes and partners, baked detours into schedules, and invested in additional ISO fleets. It's hedging you can see, rows of white containers like reserve pawns on a chessboard. For end users, the translation is straightforward. If you're an Asian fab, sync your maintenance to Qatar's published LNG turnarounds, build a buffer ahead of those windows. If you're a European hospital, blend Panhandle and Qatari contracts so one outage doesn't cut you to the bone. If you run logistics, obsess over dwell time in hot ports as much as price per liter. Qatar can carry the world far until the day it can't for a month. The winners act before the calendar does. Qatar's edge is the math of scale and the culture of uptime. Its weakness is shared fate with LNG and with geopolitics that don't care about your appointment book. When it hums, the helium world breathes easier. When it pauses, you hear the echo in countdown clocks, and MRI sweeps half a planet away. Chokepoint 3, Russia's Amur/YAML, promise and delay. Unknown to many buyers planning their budgets, a new giant was supposed to arrive from the east and make shortages boring. The plan had a name and a map: Siberia to the far east, gas processing at Amur near Svobodny, and rail lines carrying white, frost-rimmed ISO containers toward Pacific ports. Add in western Siberia's YAML gas streams, and you had a narrative: Russia as the third stabilizer after the Panhandle and Qatar. If Amur ran steady, the market would finally have slack, and your MRI date, your chip supply, and your countdown would stop living on hope. On paper, Amur looked like a turning point. Multiple processing trains, each designed to peel helium from gas streams en route to petrochemical customers and pipelines to China. Dedicated helium liquefaction, storage spheres, a container loading yard. The logistics model was unusual. Not ships leaving a coastal terminal, but long, cold rail hauls across thousands of kilometers to Vladivostok or other ports, then sea legs to Korea, Japan, and beyond. It was bold, capital heavy, and if it worked, a swing factor big enough to tame the spot market. Here's the part that mattered to end users. Contracts and calendars were written assuming certain trains would be online by certain dates. Suppliers told hospitals, fabs, and labs, relief is coming. Procurement teams marked quarters on spreadsheets when allocations might loosen. Process engineers paused reclamation projects believing new tons would make the math easier. The system shifted its hopes east. Then the commissioning reality set in. Cryogenics is unforgiving. A turboexpander wobbles, a control algorithm hunts, a weld that looked fine at ambient weeps at 4 Kelvin. Early units cycled through starts and stops, producing then pausing. Each pause was a ripple, a supplier expecting railcars on Wednesday rebooked Friday flights, a hospital that planned a normal fill got a partial. The promise didn't evaporate, it slipped by weeks, then months, then quarters. And then 2022 rewired everything. Sanctions bit in strange places. Bearings, sealants, control software patches, the small parts that keep big machines boring became procurement puzzles. Insurance for certain routes went thin. Export paperwork turned political. Some modules at Amur suffered incidents. Timelines stretched as investigations and repairs moved at a pace set by geopolitics as much as engineering. If you were counting on Amur's third or fourth unit to stabilize your quarter, you started rewriting plans on a Sunday night. YAML's role added both potential and ambiguity. Western Siberia's gas universe is vast, and helium-bearing streams exist, but the post-2022 pivot of Russian gas logistics, away from Europe, toward Asia, scrambled priorities. Building out helium recovery where the main business model was rerouting pipeline gas is hard to justify when every spare ruble an hour is triage. The net effect wasn't zero, but it wasn't the steady march the market had penciled in. Micro story. A supplier's quarterly deck showed 2 Amur trains at 80% and 60% capacity, with a third entering hot commissioning. A week later, a valve fault forced a cold box warm up. The 60% train dipped to 0 for 9 days. An R&D customer in the Netherlands lost a dilution fridge run and rewrote the semester's schedule. The supplier's rep, voice tired, said, "We'll reallocate from Asia," and then had to yank those leaders back when a port hold hit. The rail-to-sea chain introduced its own helium tax: time. Every extra day on tracks or in a port apron is boil-off you can't reclaim. In winter, Siberian air helps a bit. In summer, coastal heat eats inventory. Smart operators staged cold transfer pads, insulated better, and choreographed handoffs at night. Even so, the long supply line made Amur's helium expensive in a currency more precious than money: reliability. Yet the lure remained. If fully commissioned with reliable spares and clear logistics, Amur's multi-train design could provide the modular redundancy the market craves. One unit trips, two stay up, and the rail yard keeps loading. The problem was never physics alone. It was the intersection where physics meets politics meets procurement. After 2022, that intersection turned into a maze. Buyers adapted. Contracts started to treat Russian volumes as upside, not baseline. Asian fabs leaned harder into Qatar with stricter dwell time clauses. European hospitals blended Panhandle and Middle East sources and pushed vendors for zero-loss fill protocols. University purchasing groups stopped waiting and funded Reclaim. Everyone learned a rule that should have been obvious. Don't build your schedule on a plant you haven't seen run through a boring summer. Human moment. A scheduler in Khabarovsk watched a screen of container IDs and ambient temps and called a yard foreman to pull 3 cars into shade while a customs issue stalled paperwork. He saved a few hundred liters no patient will ever thank him for. He did it anyway. So where does Russia sit now? As promise still, as relief sometimes, as a dependable third metronome not yet. Commissioning continues, workarounds accumulate, and some volumes do flow. But the lesson travels faster than the containers. Treat new capacity as bonus until it's proven through a full maintenance cycle, a winter, a summer, and a geopolitical squall. If it passes that test, the helium world breathes out. Until then, plan like the countdown might hold, and the magnet might whisper minutes. What shortages feel like? Hospitals and MRIs. The first sign is a sound. A high-field magnet that's been quiet for years gives a thin metallic squeal as the bath warms a fraction. The charge nurse doesn't know what that means. The MRI tech does. She checks the helium gauge, glances at the delivery board, and sees a red note, allocation, partial fill only. Her next patients are a stroke follow-up, a sedated pediatric case, and an oncology staging. The helium isn't a budget line anymore, it's triage. In radiology, time runs in 30-minute blocks. Helium runs in liters per day. When the numbers fight, people move. Facilities call security to hold a service elevator after midnight. The vendor can make a partial drop at 2:10 a.m., but only if the dock is clear and the transfer lines are cold. 2 techs pull on gloves and start a ritual they learned the hard way. Purge the couplers with cold gas, pre-chill the vacuum-jacketed hose until frost traces the braid, open the magnet's fill port 1/4 turn. They talk in short sentences because waste has a sound, sharp hissing, and once you hear it, you never forget it. Micro story, at 1:57 a.m. the doer valve sticks. A tech breathes out not in to keep her hands steady. She wrenches, it breaks free, the line flashes cold, and the helium rush drops into a steady whisper. She checks the boil-off meter, lower than last time. That margin just bought a pediatric anesthesia slot at 9:00. The public thinks of MRIs as machines. The staff thinks of them as patients with moods. Each magnet has a personality. One drifts warm on humid days, one hates floor vibrations, one loses a liter an hour if a door seal is tired. In a shortage, those quirks become risks. The manager keeps a whiteboard with handwritten boil-off rates. If she doesn't have that number for each scanner, she's bleeding in the dark. When allocations hit, the board decides which magnet stays cold and which one will be idled and gently warmed. A choice nobody likes to make because a warm magnet is a rebuild waiting to happen. Here's the part you never see in marketing. A zero boil-off scanner still breathes. The recondensing unit can catch most evaporation, but it needs maintenance windows, clean cryocoolers, and service access that hospitals often schedule like an afterthought. In tight weeks, those windows vanish. A tech postpones a service call because the vendor can't guarantee parts, then loses more helium to a shield that should have been swapped. The invoice looks smaller today and larger in 6 months. Meanwhile, the waiting room fills with human stakes. A woman with a fresh stent needs an urgent check for a clot she can't feel. A kid with seizures has been fasting since midnight for sedation. A man who stayed silent for a year finally told his doctor about the pain in his spine. They don't know what helium does. They only know the scanner door stayed closed yesterday, and the receptionist used the word reschedule. When supply thins, hospitals improvise alliances. A downtown facility with 2 scanners calls a suburban partner with one and asks to borrow a doer, promising to return the favor on the next squeeze. Drivers meet at the halfway point, trade paperwork in a parking lot, and transfer precious cold with hands that move like watchmakers. A liter saved in transit is an appointment kept at dawn. Technique becomes policy. The night shift rewrites SOPs. Two-person fills only, log every transfer, pre-cool every line, 0 lost bayonets or no fill. Facilities installs a small recovery bag in the vent line, nothing fancy, just enough to catch boil off overnight and feed a compressor skid that came on a rental truck. The captured gas goes into storage cylinders. It's not a full loop, but it takes the edge off, and in a shortage, the edge is where cancellations live. Micro story, a rural hospital without a service contract got a 300-liter allocation instead of 800. The radiology director called a retired engineer who volunteers at the clinic. He walked in with a coil of vacuum-jacketed line and a bag of new gaskets, found 3 tiny leaks in the fill path, and cut losses by a third. The next week's cancer scans stayed on the calendar. And when the worst happens, when a magnet warms enough to threaten a quench, the room changes temperature without the thermostat moving. Staff clear the area, the tech hits a checklist that was written for emergencies no one expected to meet, and warm gas screams through the quench pipe to the roof. Afterward, there's silence. Refill is days away, rebuild is months. Surgeons reroute, neurologists switch to CT and accept what they can't see, and the finance office writes a number that doesn't capture the missed diagnoses. This is what helium shortage feels like inside a hospital. Not headlines, but small decisions stacked at 2 a.m. Not theory, but wrist steady over frost. Not balloons, but a child waking up on time because a tech shaved 2% off a loss nobody else noticed. Fabs on a helium diet, process and reclaim. From a hospital corridor to a cleanroom aisle, the sound changes, but the stakes feel similar. In fabs, helium is invisible plumbing for yield. It cushions plasmas in etch and PECVD, purges oxygen from chambers, and carries heat out of parts that can't afford a scratch, let alone a spark. When allocations hit 70% or 60%, the line doesn't stop. Engineers start counting atoms. First move, find the fat without breaking physics. A staff meeting in a 28 nm bay turns into a triage board. Which steps are helium critical for uniformity? Which purges are superstition from a tool recipe written in 2011? They pull logs, overlay defect maps, and circle 3 candidates. Chamber idle purges, wafer-to-wafer sweep time, and pump down margins that were padded during a bad week years ago. The new rule isn't slash, qualify. Micro story, a process engineer named Anita walks a notebook down tool 43's row at 3:12 a.m. She kills a 10-second idle purge, replaces it with a nitrogen co-flow for non-critical steps, and extends the pump down by 6 seconds. The first 5 wafers show no drift in line edge roughness. She lets 10 more run, then opens the SPC chart with a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Stable. She's just cut net helium flow 20% on that chamber without moving the defect baseline. Then comes the harder part, closing the loop. Reclaim turns exhaust into feedstock. You start by mapping where helium exits. 4 lines from etch clusters, roughing pumps on PECVD, tool vents that dump cooled purge gas. Lines get rerouted into a stainless header, and a skid the size of a delivery van takes the stream from there. Pre-filters for particles and acids, a dryer to strip moisture, a membrane stage to push nitrogen and hydrogen aside, then a PSA or cryo swing that upgrades helium to a purity the house spec will accept. A small buffer tank smooths the burps. A compressor lifts pressure to the plant header. It sounds neat in a brochure. In practice, reclaim is choreography. 4-line valves chatter. Maintenance pops a flange and dumps an hour's worth of capture to atmosphere if you didn't write lockouts into SOPs. Chemical byproducts from exotic chemistries poison membranes if you miss a filter change. The winning fabs treat the skid like a tool. Owner, PM schedule, SPC on purity and flow. When purity dips, a light blinks on a screen in the same control room that watches focus and dose. The math is stubborn but rewarding. An in-bay loop capturing 60% of purge exhaust might return 40% net after losses. If helium is $30 per 1,000 standard cubic feet today and twice that tomorrow, the payback tightens every allocation. A pilot on 1 etch cluster becomes 2 clusters, then a bay. Procurement shifts from arguing unit price to hammering uptime guarantees and membrane replacement schedules into the vendor's contract. Micro story, a night shift tech named Jorge hears a hiss near the reclaim header that wasn't there yesterday. He puts a hand on a clamp, feels the cold bite, and calls maintenance. They find a hairline cut in a gasket that looks fine at room temp and leaks at 10 torr. 20 minutes later, the hiss is gone. The skid's flow meter climbs back 3 points. It's nothing on paper. It's a week of buffer inventory over a quarter. Recipes evolve alongside plumbing. Nitrogen co-flow where chemistry allows. Helium lean plasma steps proven by DOE instead of hunch. Chamber seasoning redesigned to use helium only at the edge where micro-arcing was an issue. Metrology backs it up. Scatterometry shows no thickness drift, CD-SEM stay boring, and reliability pulls don't flinch. Where helium can't move, ultra-high aspect vias, brittle low-K films, it stays. Everywhere else it trims. Scheduling is a lever too. Pre-purge and season during night power valleys. Batch helium-intensive layers so the reclaim skid runs steady instead of spiky. Stage pre-purged spare chambers so a tool swap doesn't start from warm metal. Align tool maintenance with supplier deliveries so you don't waste fresh helium seeding O-rings on a day the truck is late. Suppliers meet you halfway when you meet them in writing. Contracts tie a slice of volume to uptime at an upstream helium recovery plant the fab helped pay for. When the plant trips, liquid nitrogen credits kick in to backfill less critical purge steps. When Qatar announces a turnaround, the fab's calendar already shows a 2-week helium diet with recipes on the shelf, not in a draft email. Human moment, the yield lead brings donuts to the reclaim team on a Tuesday nobody will remember. He points at the bay's big screen. Return flow nudged up 2% after a membrane swap. That 2% is $20,000 a week and 3 days of safety stock no one will panic about next month. He tells them thanks. He means it. The culture change is the real product. Helium stops being the gas we've always used and becomes a parameter with owners, charts, and contingency plans. The fab learns to diet without starving, reclaim what you can, prove where you can't, and write your next quarter so a missed train in Texas or a hot week in Ras-Laffan becomes a line item, not a line stoppage. Labs, neutron sources, and quantum, survival technique. Meanwhile, on the other side of the calendar, science runs on windows you can't